So I've inserted all of the durations that I believe these tasks will take. I have some in weeks, some in days, and you'll see that there's only one that's red, and that's the current longest activity amongst the group, and in this case HVAC procurement. That's because that's driving the schedule right now. We don't have any of the activities linked, so the longest duration is going to drive. Once we start inserting the logic, the predecessors and successors, then the critical path will emerge amongst the activities that are on the critical path. So these bars are fairly long right now and aesthetically, so you can make adjustments to that fairly simply by double clicking on this bar above the Gantt chart, and you'll see the size here. This will help reduce the Gantt chart size. You'll see it reducing, and as I lower it and hit OK, so automatically then you see the bars reduce. So this applies when you're trying to format the schedule to look a certain way in the PDF if it's extending in the pages too far. It's a helpful tool. You can also set your units in months, which helps, and you can also, instead of having two tiers with months and weeks and days, you can set it to a single, and that will allow you to further reduce the bar size. So I'm going to increase this a bit more so it looks a little better. And there you go. So starting with pre-construction, we have all of our durations in there now. And now we're going to start inserting the logic. So a couple of things to track just in general, and each schedule is going to be slightly different based on the job and what the owner may or may not want to see, or the subcontractors. But it's important to track a couple milestones, and that's execution of our contract and the early procurement items, because they often drive the schedule, as you can see in this case already with the 10-week HVAC procurement. So when you're tracking pre-construction, it's important to have some of these items in there. Obviously, permit issuance is what's going to drive the start of the work, but contract execution is as important and should be on the critical path to the project start. So I'm going to go ahead and get started and start putting some logic in here. So what's most important about inserting logic is, and then the reason we have both the predecessor and the successor column, is that in order to have a truly correct critical path schedule, every single activity, with the exception of the first and the last, must have a predecessor and a successor. And the reason that is that if an activity isn't linked with another one, then it isn't driving an activity, and it can be completed at any point. But that's just not the case. Every activity will ultimately be on the critical path if not completed in a certain time. Some tasks just can be completed over a longer duration before it becomes critical, and that's what's called slack. So starting at the top, let's start putting in some logic here. So the predecessor. So what is the predecessor activity that is going to drive the city plan check submittal? Well, that's obviously the design. So activity number 2 is driving that one. Before we get any further, there's 3 main types of logic that we are going to use and look at. There's a finish to start relationship, which is what you see here. When this activity design finishes, you can start your plan check submittal process. There is a start to start, which looks like this, and essentially means that when this activity starts, so can the permit issuance. And in this case, that wouldn't work, but I'll show you that as we go down the line and how that will function. And the other type of logic we were going to look at is a finish to finish relationship, which means that when an activity finishes, so does its linked activity. And where that may apply is you would like 2 activities to finish in and around the same date, but you want to start one of those who has a lower duration as far along as possible, and that will be a finish to finish. And I'll show you what that means and looks like as well. So I'm going to go down the line a little bit and start inserting it. It's important that you guys start from the top and work your way down. So once the city plan check submittal is in, well, that duration doesn't look right to me. So let's make a quick adjustment. Typical city, we'll call it 6 weeks. So now, after the plan check submittal, the permit's going to be issued. That means activity number 3 is the predecessor. So what's driving the execution of the contract? Well, you can link that to a number of different activities. But say the design team is released, and that's when you start your negotiations of your contract. So since the design's 20 days, maybe 10 days after design starts, that's when you start the negotiation of your contract. So in that case, the predecessor will be design number 2 with the start-to-start relationship, but I want it to start 10 days later, so I'm going to add 10. Simply insert 2 start-to-start plus 10, and you'll see that 10 days after the design starts, the contract is executed, or the contract execution task begins, and then it finishes on the 27th because it took 2 weeks. And that obviously would drive subcontracts and insurance. So I'm going to put in activity number 5 as the driver for that. Submittals happen after the subcontracts are issued because then you have your subcontractors on board. So I'm going to put 6. HVAC procurement happens after the submittals are complete. So that's going to be activity 7. And along with lighting procurement as well. So lighting procurement is going to start after submittals. That'll also be driven by activity number 7. So I'm looking at this, it's shaping up nicely. There is one thing that I see here where there's no successor, and that's in permit issued. Well, as we discussed earlier, we can't have a truly critical path schedule unless every activity has a predecessor and successor. So what's the next driver for the permit issuance date? Well, I would say mobilization, right? So I'm going to look down, where's my mobilization? Right here, activity number 12. And I'm just going to go ahead and type it in. As I type in 12, that means that the permit issuance date automatically becomes the predecessor for mobilization. And you'll see that the 4 popped up right there. So now this is looking pretty good. There's a couple activities in here that aren't linked to anything, HVAC procurement, because that really happens later down the line. So the HVAC procurement may not be able to start until the HVAC procurement is really going to apply to the equipment, and we can't start the installation until 10 weeks later. Well, all I have is a line item in here for overhead MEP, but that isn't necessarily ductwork. That's going to be the equipment. So I'm looking down the line. I don't see the equipment anywhere. So I'm going to go ahead and insert a line farther down for HVAC equipment. And we'll call that a 3-week installation. Well, now I know that I have rooftop equipment I didn't pick up. Now that procurement is driving activity number 24. So I'm going to go up here, I'm going to type in 24. For lighting, we know the lighting is going to go into the grid. So where's my in-grid MEP? Right here, activity number 27. So I'm going to go ahead and type in 27 as the successor, and you'll see that activity number 9 is now driving the in-grid MEP. So I'm going to show you a start-to-start relationship. So after we mobilize and lay out, safe off, the default setting for activities, if you just type in the number, is finish to start. So you have to tell the software to change to a start to start or a finish to finish. So demo will start as a finish to start after mobilization. That's fine. And overhead MEP will begin as a finish to start to demolition. But so we have 3 weeks of overhead MEP rough-in, but we certainly don't have to wait until the end of that time to start a rough framing. So how far into the overhead MEP do we want to start our rough framing? Well, we want to get out over the wall, so let's just call it a week in. So in that case, the predecessor to activity 15 for rough framing is activity number 14. as a start-to-start relationship plus 1 week. And you'll see now, rough framing will be going at the same time as overhead MEP roughing. So I'm going to continue inserting the remainder of the logic, and then I'll show you how to make adjustments and see if we can figure out any issues or see any ways we can improve or see anywhere that is inefficient.